A white mist engulfed the twisted metal, leaving the survivors alone with the deafening silence of the Andes. The temperature dropped every day, mercilessly freezing the last remnants of warmth from the sailors' exhausted bodies. They found themselves completely isolated amid endless snows, tightly squeezed between the frozen cliffs. No one expected it to end this way. At first, they didn't realize how bad things were. They still believed that rescue would come, but no one in the whole world knew where they were. Supplies were running out rapidly, and the realization that help might never arrive was slowly driving them mad. That was the moment after which everything changed. The horizon remained completely empty and cold. At that moment, everything had already been decided. There was no turning back. Only an icy unknown lay ahead. But nature had already made its decision. The snow did not merely cover the mountains. It seemed like an endless ocean of frozen death, swallowing up any trace of life. On October 13th, 1972, the Andes became an impassable wall for the Uruguayan plain. The mangled metal of the fuselage stood out as a black spot against the backdrop of the blindingly white slope at an altitude of over 3,000 meters. At that moment, Nando Parrado did not yet grasp the scale of the disaster, slowly coming to his senses after the terrible crash. The temperature was plummeting, reaching 30 degrees below zero, and every breath burned his lungs with ice crystals. The icy air instantly penetrated the thin fabric of his summer clothes, restricting his movements and freezing his blood. Nando tried to move, but his body responded only with a dull, throbbing pain in his shattered head. He didn't know that this was only the beginning, the first day of his real and longest ordeal. All around lay the motionless bodies of his comrades, contorted into unnatural poses amid the wreckage of seats and luggage. 12 people died instantly, the very second the plane crashed into an invisible rock. The survivors were in a state of deep shock, unable to comprehend what had happened around them. It was the moment after which everything changed forever, dividing their lives into before and after. The horizon was empty, filled only with an endless ridge of snow-capped peaks fading into the gray mist. And Nando knew this, gazing at the boundless white desert where there was not a single sign of civilization. The wind picked up, beginning to methodically cover the traces of the crash with cold, prickly snow. Nature was in no hurry to kill the survivors. It was simply waiting for them to give up on their own. At first, no one wanted to voice what was swirling in the minds of every survivor. They still believed that rescue would come within the next few hours, as soon as the world learned of their disappearance. Nando kept staring at the sky, hoping to hear the saving hum of helicopters through the howling wind. But hope doesn't change reality, and reality was complete solitude among the dead rocks. The first hours after the crash turned into a chaotic attempt to set up shelter inside the wrecked cabin. People tried to plug the huge hole in the tail section with suitcases and the remains of the torn metal skin. Their hands were losing sensation, their fingers stiff from frostbite, but primal fear kept them moving. Each subsequent step became harder than the last, sapping the last crumbs of precious energy. The first night fell, bringing with it absolute impenetrable darkness and truly cosmic cold. The survivors huddled together, trying to warm themselves with their breath in the heat of strangers' trembling bodies. No one heard the cries of those dying from their wounds under the cover of that dreadful, icy night. The most terrifying thing was not the pain, but the silence, broken only by moans and the creaking of freezing metal. By morning, it became clear that the mountains had claimed several more lives, mercilessly reducing the number of survivors. Panic spread faster than the cold, seeping into the deepest corners of their weakened minds. None of them yet grasped the scale of what was happening, still hoping for a swift evacuation. But time was already working against them, turning every passing minute into a form of torture. Nando sat in the snow, hugging his knees, and stared at the lifeless face of his mother, who had died in the impact. At that moment, everything depended solely on him and his ability to keep a cool head. He began to realize that there would be no help in the coming hours, and he would have to rely only on his own strength. The world continued on as usual, but for him and his companions, time had stopped forever. From that day on, the expedition was over, giving way to the harsh and merciless reality of the wild. In a single second, the young athletes ceased to be carefree passengers and became doomed prisoners of the mountains. the story of their ambitions came to an end, ushering in days of incredible, unbearable suffering. They did not know it yet, but from that moment on, they ceased to be explorers and became survivors. The journey began in sunny Montevideo, where the air was filled with laughter and the anticipation of celebration. The rugby team was heading to Chile for a friendly match, full of energy and youthful confidence. An atmosphere of absolute carefreeness reigned in the cabin. No one thought about the possible dangers of flying over the Andes. They were young, incredibly healthy, and convinced that the whole world belonged only to them. No one was prepared to survive in extreme conditions. Since their main goal was the game and relaxation, their luggage contained light suits, short-sleeved shirts, and shoes completely unsuitable for the harsh glaciers. The illusion of safety lulled them into complacency, hiding the true power of the mountain ranges behind fluffy clouds. They were walking toward their fate, blindly trusting the instruments and the skill of experienced military pilots. The weather began to deteriorate rapidly even as they approached the mountains, forcing the crew to make an unscheduled stop in Mendoza. This direct warning from nature was ignored in the interest of saving time and the burning desire to reach their destination as soon as possible. The plane took to the air again, heading straight into the cold heart of the approaching snowstorm. They still called it a simple delay, but it was already a trap set and snapping shut. Thick cloud cover completely obscured visual landmarks, forcing the pilots to navigate solely by estimated flight time. The winds over the Andes turned out to be much stronger than anticipated, significantly reducing the heavy aircraft's cruising speed. The crew reported to air traffic controllers that they had crossed the pass, being absolutely certain of their mathematical calculations. This fatal error became the starting point of their slow descent into the icy, yawning abyss. The plane began to descend smoothly, piercing through a thick veil of white clouds in search of the runway at Santiago Airport. Instead of a green, fertile valley, sheer cliffs covered in centuries-old solid ice suddenly appeared in the windows. The passengers did not immediately realize what was happening, staring spellbound at the terrifyingly close granite walls. At that moment, the story had already begun to unfold, counting down the final seconds of their once peaceful lives. The engines roared strenuously at full power, trying to lift the heavy aircraft above the looming granite peak. But the laws of physics proved inexorable, and the heavy metal could not overcome Earth's gravity in time. The plane's right wing struck a sharp rock, instantly losing a vital load-bearing part of its structure. There was no turning back. The trajectory of the fatal descent was finally and irrevocably sealed. The second wing broke off a second later, taking the tail section and several terrified passengers with it. The fuselage turned into an uncontrollable metal projectile, hurtling down the steep snow-covered slope at tremendous speed. People were mercilessly hurled around the cabin, crushing seats and snapping fragile bones with a dry, terrifying crack. It was the end of their carefree youth and the cruelest beginning of a test of endurance. The slide came to an abrupt halt with a sharp impact against a deep snowdrift, which crushed the cockpit like thin paper. The silence that followed the screech of tearing metal seemed unnatural and terrifyingly deafening. Snow dust slowly settled on the wreckage of the plane, gradually obscuring the extent of the monstrous destruction. None of them yet understood where they had ended up or what they were about to face in the future. The survivors began to slowly crawl out from under the twisted wreckage, looking around in blank bewilderment. There was nothing around them but white snow, jagged black rocks, and a piercing, icy, howling wind. They looked at one another and saw only wild fear reflected in their pupils, dilated with terror. The world was too far away, securely cut off by impassable miles of the dead, frozen Cordilleras. Roberto Canessa, a young medical student, was the first to begin examining the moaning wounded, trying to provide whatever help he could. His practical knowledge was extremely limited, and professional medical equipment was completely absent. He did everything he could, using scraps of other people's clothing and dirty materials at hand to make tight bandages. On that cold day, the long countdown of their lives began, where every new minute could be their last. The first few days merged into an endless succession of sharp pain, piercing cold, and fruitless waiting for help. The survivors subsisted only on scraps of chocolate and tart wine found in their broken suitcases, saving every drop. But these meager supplies were dwindling before their eyes, offering absolutely no sustenance to their weakened bodies. Everyone clearly understood that the supplies were not endless, but no one wanted to speak of it aloud. Nando Parado watched as his younger sister slowly faded away in his arms from her severe injuries. He desperately warmed her with his breath, trying to hold on to the life slipping away from her weakening, cold body. But nature made absolutely no distinction between the strong and the weak, methodically claiming its victims. On the 8th day, she died quietly, leaving Nando in complete and hopeless solitude amid the icy hell. The cold became their constant, cruel companion, seeping under their skin and freezing their deepest thoughts. The thin walls of the fuselage offered absolutely no protection from the piercing wind, which howled wildly through the cracks at night. The people slept huddled tightly together, covering themselves with dirty seat covers and other people's spare belongings. They began to ration their words as strictly as their food, conserving precious energy to stay warm. Physical exhaustion had transformed them beyond recognition, sharpening their once soft facial features and making their movements agonizingly slow. Hunger mercilessly gnawed at their empty stomachs, causing sharp pains and triggering the first visual hallucinations. They tried chewing on the raw leather of their belts and suitcases, but this only intensified their suffering. Their bodies began to consume themselves, rapidly depleting their last meager reserves of fat and muscle mass. Some were already mentally calculating who exactly would be the next weak link in this terrifying chain of survival. The team began to rapidly fall apart under the pressure of unbearable weather conditions and constant stress. Discipline cracked deeply, giving way to primal animal instincts and the primal fear of death. They were divided not only by the endless icy desert, but also by gnawing doubt about the point of continuing the struggle. Hope for a miraculous rescue grew fainter with every sunset of the cold sun behind the snowy peaks. They continued to speak aloud of helicopters, but believed less and less that their words would ever become reality. Someone would stare motionless for hours at the empty sky, hoping to spot even the slightest trace of human presence. But the horizon remained utterly indifferent, reflecting only the blinding light of the sun and the soulless cold. On one of those endless days, they found a small transistor radio among a pile of luggage debris. This fragile device became their only link to the outside world and the warmth of civilization. With incredible difficulty, they picked up a faint signal from a Chilean radio station, holding their breath in anticipation of news. The announcer's words sounded like a death sentence: final, cruel, and beyond appeal. The radio reported dispassionately that the search and rescue operation had been officially called off due to excessively difficult weather conditions. The world had long since declared them dead, calmly turned the page, and moved on, leaving them to freeze on the slope. It was at that very moment that they realized the absolute depth and hopelessness of their isolation. No one would come to their aid. No one would descend from those empty skies to rescue them. In that freezing second, they understood that the most dangerous thing was not the cold, but the piercing, deadly despair. Some began to cry quietly, others instantly froze in shock, unable to process what they had just heard. Nando Parado silently clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, refusing to accept certain death as inevitable. He wasn't afraid of death itself. What he feared most was not being found and being forgotten in these snows. From that dreadful day on, they found themselves cut off from humanity not only physically, but also mentally. No one had prepared them for loneliness on such a colossal scale, where you cease to exist for the rest of the world. The question was not whether everyone present would survive until the arrival of the saving, warm spring. The question was much harsher and more terrifying. Who exactly would be the last one left on this cursed glacier? The realization that all search efforts had ceased presented them with the most terrifying dilemma of their lives. Hunger had reached that critical stage where the weakened body begins to fail and the mind completely shuts down its moral restraints. There were no plants or animals around, only snow, dead rocks, and the frozen bodies of their dead friends. Life relentlessly demanded energy, and the only available source of that energy lay right before them. Roberto Canessa was the first to voice the very thought that had long been hanging in the freezing air of the fuselage. He calmly explained that their own bodies were dying, and without animal protein, they wouldn't last even a few days. This decision was extremely difficult, provoking the strongest revulsion on a deep animal and instinctive level. But the choice was crystal clear: either die in agony from exhaustion or cross the forbidden line. At first, no one wanted to take responsibility for this terrible, sacrilegious step. They discussed it for hours on end, desperately trying to find justification before God and themselves. In the end, they made a grim, silent pact. If anyone died, the others had the right to use their body to survive. It was a terrifying agreement among the doomed, an unspoken contract signed with blood, snow, and utter despair. The first cut was made with trembling hands, eyes tightly shut, and a silent prayer on frozen lips. The taste of raw, frozen meat brought no relief to the soul, but it gave the necessary energy to the fading body. They forced themselves to swallow, painfully fighting nausea and tears, realizing that this was the only cure for death. In that terrible moment, they ceased to be part of normal, civilized human society forever. Their most dangerous enemy was not the hypothetical condemnation of a society that did not exist here, but their own inflamed minds. They tried never to look at the frozen faces of those they had to eat. They deliberately dried the meat in the sun so that it would look less like real human flesh. This gradually turned into a harsh, mechanical procedure for sustaining the flickering life within their fading physical shells. From that turning point, everything changed. There was no turning back to the normal world for their fragile psyches. They had crossed that invisible line beyond which human laws end and pure, brutal biology begins. Nando Parrado forced himself to eat more than the others because even then he had firmly decided that he had to get out of there. He methodically saved his meager strength for the impossible journey across the mountains that was taking shape in his mind. Discipline took on new, distorted forms based on very strict control over the remnants of protein-rich food. They began to divide into work groups, assigning the strongest men the heavy labor of obtaining this sustenance. No one knew who exactly would survive until the next dawn in these inhuman, unbearable conditions. Every cold morning began with a routine check of their neighbors' pulses on the makeshift icy bed. The silence between them grew heavier than the wind. They had almost completely stopped talking about abstract topics. People's eyes had grown dull. They reflected only the endless whiteness of the snow and a dead emptiness. They continued to act as the crew of a single ship, but thought exclusively as doomed suicide victims. Nature watched their downfall with the indifference of ancient, immovable mountain ranges. Nevertheless, this terrible decision bore fruit, allowing them to temporarily halt the process of physical extinction. They gained the necessary time, postponing their inevitable end by several long, agonizing weeks. But the mountains had no intention of letting their captives go so easily, preparing a new, even more devastating blow. The glacier seemed to hold its breath before unleashing all its pent-up fury upon them. They naively thought that the worst was already behind them and that they had reached the absolute depths of human existence. They still sincerely believed that they could control their fate within the strict confines of this distorted world. But they had forgotten that they were at the complete mercy of a force of nature that obeys no human agreements. White death was already gathering on the steep slope directly above their pitiful, fragile shelter. October 29th began as the most ordinary frosty and gray day in their icy prison. The survivors prepared for a restless sleep, huddling inside the fuselage and barricading the entrance with suitcases against the cold wind. Outside, a blizzard raged furiously, obscuring the outlines of the cliffs and piling tons of fresh snow onto the treacherous slopes. Nothing foreshadowed the new catastrophe that was about to rob them of their last sense of fragile safety. The sound came suddenly, very much like the muffled roar of a jet engine or a distant underground explosion. An avalanche broke loose from the summit without warning, sweeping away everything in its path with incredible, colossal speed. Millions of tons of compressed snow slammed into the damaged fuselage, breaching the entrance's protective barrier. In a single fleeting second, the interior was filled with a dense, damp, and suffocating white mass. The people found themselves instantly buried alive under a layer of icy concrete several meters thick in complete, impenetrable darkness. The air ran out instantly. Their lungs tore from futile attempts to take even a single convulsive breath. Those who were awake began frantically digging themselves out with their bare hands, tearing their frostbitten nails until they bled. Animal panic gripped their bodies when they realized that the fuselage had turned into a veritable mass grave. Nando Parado was slightly luckier. His face was not far from the surface of the snowdrift that had formed. A comrade miraculously managed to dig out his head, allowing him to take a precious, life-saving breath of oxygen. Indescribable, primal chaos reigned all around. The moans of those suffocating, screams of terror, and the eerie screech of crumpling metal. Everyone tried to save themselves and those they could reach in this absolute darkness. When the first wave of panic subsided slightly, they realized with horror the new catastrophic losses in their ranks. The avalanche had mercilessly claimed the lives of 8 more people, quietly suffocating them under the thick snow while they slept. The survivors found themselves tightly trapped in a cramped space beneath a heavy, multi-meter thick shell of snow. There was no way back. The only exit to the outside was completely sealed off by a solid ice plug. They spent the next 3 days in this white coffin, completely unable to stand up straight. There was a catastrophic shortage of oxygen. They had to breathe rarely and very shallowly, conserving the remaining air as much as possible. They sat in complete darkness, huddled close to the bodies of their comrades who had just perished. It was a terrible ordeal, far surpassing all their previous nightmares combined. They had to punch a small hole in the cabin roof with a metal rod to keep from suffocating. Through this tiny hole seeped a faint gray light and icy air that cut painfully into their lungs. But it was their only window to the world, a thin lifeline connecting the buried to the surface. Life had shrunk to the size of a cramped, incredibly icy burrow, thoroughly saturated with the stench of death. They finally realized that the shelter that had protected them from the wind had become a deadly trap. Staying in the plane any longer meant waiting for the next avalanche to finish the job. On the 4th day, they miraculously managed to dig a tunnel to the outside and emerge into the blinding white light. They greedily inhaled the fresh, frosty air, squinting painfully as their eyes, unaccustomed to the bright sun, stung. The fuselage was completely hidden under the snow, having finally merged with the surrounding desolate mountain landscape. From that moment on, they fully realized that their only hope of rescue lay in their own 2 feet. The decision to trek across the mountains for help was pure madness, bordering on outright suicide. They had no warm mountaineering gear, no suitable clothing, and no map of the surrounding area. They didn't even know the exact direction, merely assuming blindly that they were on the western slope of the Andes. But staying with the wreckage meant dying a slow and agonizing death from severe exhaustion and the biting cold. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa were chosen for this mission as the strongest of those remaining. A long and painstaking preparation for the trek began, sapping the last shreds of energy from all the survivors. They sewed a large sleeping bag from thick insulating material found in the tail of the crashed plane. This bag was their only chance of surviving long nights in the open air at sub-zero temperatures. Everyone understood that the lives of 2 people and everyone else depended directly on the quality of this sleeping bag. It was a symbol of their shared fragile hope, sewn together from utter despair and pain. The best cuts of meat were set aside for the expedition, in an effort to provide the trekkers with as many calories as possible. Nando and Roberto were completely relieved of their daily heavy work at the camp, so they could conserve their strength. They gazed at the peaks surrounding them and tried to guess which one concealed the path to salvation. But the mountains remained haughtily silent, rising as impassable walls of ice all the way to the gray sky. The days of waiting for favorable weather dragged on endlessly, wearing the nerves of the exhausted men down to the limit. Blizzards were often followed by fierce winds that knocked them off their feet and swept away any landmarks on the horizon. Nando spent hours gazing at the peak rising in the west, which they would have to struggle to conquer. He knew that this ascent might be the last thing he would see in his short life. During those agonizing days of waiting, they began writing farewell letters to their loved ones, preparing for the worst possible outcome. On scraps of paper found in their suitcases, they left their final, heartfelt words of love and apology. These thin sheets of paper were soaked with tears and the realization that they might never leave these icy wastes. The world was too far away, but they desperately tried to reach it with their thoughts. Roberto often doubted the success of the venture. His medical knowledge told him such a crossing was impossible. He understood that their bodies were broken, and any serious exertion would easily cause cardiac arrest. But Nando was unyielding. He was driven forward by a blind, irrational, and powerful will to live. His obsession infected the others, forcing them to believe in a miracle where there was no room for one. Just before setting out, they fashioned makeshift goggles from the plastic of the cabin window to protect their eyes from the glare. The sun in the mountains reflected off the snow with such intensity that it would burn the sensitive retina in a matter of hours. They insulated their shoes further with scraps of thick fabric and spare pairs of socks taken from the dead. Everything was ready for the final push, which would forever decide their fate. On December 12, 1972, the moment came for a difficult farewell to the others. The survivors embraced tightly in silence, without uttering a word, for everything was already perfectly clear. The first few hours of the steep ascent were incredibly difficult for them. Every step required a colossal effort of will. The air at altitude grew increasingly thin, causing their weak lungs to burn with fire with every breath. The snow gave way beneath their feet, hiding treacherous, deep crevasses and sharp rocks beneath its soft surface. They walked in silence, conserving their breath, lost in their own dark thoughts of survival. Nando led the way, stubbornly cutting steps into the hard fern. Roberto followed behind him, stepping into the tracks he left. Their pace was agonizingly slow. They advanced only a few meters at a time, often stopping every few minutes to rest. The temperature began to drop rapidly as the sun set, reminding them of the need to find shelter. But there wasn't a single flat spot on the slope, only steep ice stretching up into the sky. Their first night on the slope became a real, harsh test of the durability of their makeshift sleeping bag. They crawled inside, huddling close together, and tried to warm themselves with their own body heat at the edge of the abyss. The next day, the slope grew even steeper, turning into an almost vertical wall of ice. They had absolutely no crampons or ice axes. They had to cling to the tiniest ledges with their frozen fingers. One wrong move, one breaking off ice floe, would mean certain death from a long fall. Fear paralyzed their muscles, but they forced themselves to climb upward, meter by life-saving meter. Nando desperately felt that the peak was already close, that beyond it lay the green valleys of Chile and salvation. This faint hope sustained him, forcing him to ignore the sharp pain in his muscles and the unbearable fatigue. He pressed forward, driven by the desire to see the end of this endless white nightmare as soon as possible. Nature made no distinctions. It simply lined their path with its most formidable bastions. On the third day of their journey, Nando finally reached the summit of the peak they had been scaling for so long. He pulled himself up with trembling hands, expecting to see the long-awaited greenery and signs of human habitation below. But what met his gaze nearly broke him completely and irrevocably. The horizon was empty, filled only with endless chains of the same snow-capped mountains, stretching into eternity. In that terrible moment, he realized that their calculations had been wrong. They were in the very heart of the mountain range. Chile was much farther away than they had thought, hidden behind dozens of kilometers of impassable peaks. Nando stood on the summit, utterly alone, buffeted by the icy wind, and gazed at his shattered hope. No one heard his silent scream, forever stuck in his parched throat. When Roberto climbed up to him and saw the same endless landscape, his strength left him. He collapsed helplessly into the snow, categorically refusing to go any further into this endless, lifeless void. At first it seemed like a delay, but now it had turned into a harsh, final verdict. They sat at an altitude of nearly 5,000 meters, exhausted, broken, and utterly alone. But Nando refused to give up. His mind had switched to a mode of absolute survival at any cost. He looked at Roberto and firmly stated that he would go on alone if Roberto decided to return to the plane. Roberto looked into his friend's eyes and realized that turning back meant certain death. They rose in silence and began the arduous descent into the unknown valley stretching out before them. This descent marked the beginning of a new, even more grueling phase of their endless mountain journey. Each subsequent step became harder than the last, their joints creaking painfully under the strain of the steep slope. They walked along a narrow ridge, balancing on the edge between life and death in a world of white silence. A long journey lay ahead of them, and no one could guarantee that they would make it to the end. The trek across the mountains had turned into a mechanical repetition of the same actions. A step, a deep breath, another step. Their bodies were working at the absolute limit of their physical capabilities, burning the last crumbs of inner energy in the furnace of survival. They had stopped feeling the sharp pain in their worn-out feet. It had become merely a constant background noise in their minds. Their minds shut out everything else, focusing solely on maintaining balance on the slippery rocks. The snow gradually gave way to rocky scree, which treacherously slipped beneath their feet, threatening to send them tumbling down. Walking over sharp rocks in worn-out shoes was pure torture. Every step sent a sharp pain through their spines. But the appearance of the rocks meant they were descending lower, where the air was becoming slightly denser and warmer. They drank meltwater from mountain streams, which tasted sweet to them after 2 months of snow. On the 7th day of the journey, the landscape around us began to change slowly but surely, offering new glimmers of hope. The first timid signs of vegetation appeared, sparse tufts of dry grass pushing through the rocky soil. For people who had seen nothing but white for 70 days, this tough grass was a true miracle. They touched it with their calloused fingers, not believing their eyes and fearing it was a mirage. The air temperature rose noticeably. The icy shell of the high mountains gave way to the saving warmth of the foothills. They were finally able to take off some of their warm clothing, which now felt like a heavy and unnecessary armor. But Roberto's physical exhaustion had reached a critical point. He began to suffer severely from dysentery. Every kilometer cost him an incredible effort. He often fell and could not get up without help. Nando stubbornly carried not only his own heavy backpack, but also some of Roberto's belongings, supporting his friend. He kept going because stopping meant dying right there, a step away from possible rescue. He no longer counted the days. He counted only the remaining chances of reaching living people. Time had finally merged into a single endless day, filled with pain, sweat, and desperate stubbornness. Soon they came to a mountain river whose turbulent current blocked their path to the saving west. Walking along its bank was very difficult because of the thick thickets of brush and piles of slippery boulders, but the river was a sure sign that they were moving in the right direction, down toward the valleys. They followed the current as if it were Ariadne's thread in this endless labyrinth of rocks. On the 9th day, they saw the first real signs of human activity on the opposite bank of the river. There were cows grazing peacefully in the green meadows, unaware of the presence of the 2 mountain ghosts. The sight of the domestic animals brought tears to Nando's eyes, which he could no longer hold back. It was proof that the world of the living existed and that they had finally reached its borders. They tried to shout, but the roar of the mountain river swallowed their weak, hoarse voices without a trace. They waved their arms, but there was no one around except for the indifferent animals, methodically chewing grass. Evening was quickly descending on the valley, forcing them to prepare for another night on the cold rocks. They fell asleep with the clear realization that salvation lay just a few hundred meters away from them. The morning of the 10th day greeted them with a thick fog, lying heavy over the rushing waters of the mountain river. Nando woke up first and began to peer intently at the opposite bank, searching for even the slightest movement. Suddenly, through the gray veil of fog, he saw the figure of a man sitting on a horse on the other side of the stream. At that moment, everything depended on whether this lone rider would notice them. Nando rushed to the water's edge, waving his arms and shouting with all his remaining strength. The man on the other bank stopped his horse and looked in their direction with obvious surprise. The river roared too loudly, making it impossible for them to hear each other. But eye contact had been made, and the hope that had eluded them for so long had become a reality. The man on horseback turned out to be Sergio Catalan, a Chilean shepherd who was making his rounds through his pastures in the foothills. He couldn't make out Nando's words because of the noise of the water, but he realized that the people in front of him were in trouble. The shepherd threw a stone across the river with a piece of paper and a pencil tied to it. It was their first contact with civilization, after 72 days of complete isolation. A few hours later, Chilean carabineros arrived at the river, summoned by Sergio Catalan. They ferried Nando and Roberto across the raging current, carefully supporting their emaciated bodies. The soldiers looked at them as if they were resurrected corpses whom everyone had long forgotten. Their faces were sunburned, their bodies resembled skeletons covered in skin, and their eyes burned with a feverish fire. The news that the passengers of the Uruguayan flight had been found alive spread like wildfire across the globe. Journalists, doctors, and military personnel flooded into the small mountain village to witness this miracle with their own eyes. Nando and Roberto found themselves at the center of an incredible amount of attention, for which they were completely unprepared. Just yesterday, they were fighting for every breath, and today they had become the main heroes of every news report. The rescue operation to evacuate the remaining survivors began immediately, despite the bad weather in the mountains. Nando, despite being extremely exhausted, volunteered to fly in a helicopter to show the exact crash site. He sat in the cockpit of the rescue helicopter, looking at the very same peaks that had nearly killed him. Now these mountains seemed smaller, having lost their mystical and invincible power over him. When the helicopters appeared above the wrecked fuselage, the people left behind at the camp could not believe their eyes. They ran out into the snow, waving their arms frantically, crying and hugging each other in a fit of hysterical joy. 72 days of waiting had come to an end. Their prayers had finally been answered. It was a moment of incredible catharsis, shattering the walls of their icy prison forever. On December 23, 1972, rescuers began evacuating the group. The helicopter pilots were stunned by the conditions in which these people had managed to survive for more than 2 months. They loaded the emaciated passengers on board, trying not to look at the remains scattered around the camp. Everyone understood the incredible price that had been paid for this life, but no one asked unnecessary questions. On that day, they left the place that had become their home, their purgatory, and the grave of their comrades. The helicopters rose into the sky, carrying the 16 survivors away from the white nightmare of the Cordilleras. They looked down at a small black dot on the snow, realizing they were leaving a part of themselves behind. Nature made no distinctions. It simply let them go, keeping its icy secrets to itself. A long road to recovery awaited them, both physical and psychological. Back in the midst of civilization, the world had carried on, and now they had to learn anew how to exist within it. They returned from the mountains as completely different people, forever changed by what they had endured and accomplished. From that moment on, time became their ally once more, but memory remained their eternal burden. The return home to Montevideo was filled with tears of joy, embraces, and deep sorrow for those who had not returned. The survivors were reunited with their families, who had long since mourned them and buried them in their hearts. It was a resurrection, a miracle that defied the strict limits of ordinary human understanding. But their joy was overshadowed by the need to tell the truth about how they had managed to survive on the glacier. When the truth about cannibalism became public knowledge, society recoiled in horror and incomprehension. Journalists asked uncomfortable questions, trying to find cheap sensationalism in these people's most terrible tragedy. The survivors had to issue a public statement to protect their dignity and the memory of the deceased. They explained that it was not a choice between good and evil, but a choice between life and death. The Catholic Church issued a statement justifying their actions in the face of extreme desperation and necessity. This brought some relief, but it could not completely erase the stigma left by public opinion. The survivors stuck together, forming an unbreakable brotherhood, bound by shared blood and the secrecy of the high mountains. No one but themselves could fully understand what had happened at an altitude of 3,000 meters. The remains of the dead were buried by the rescuers right there on the mountain, beneath a large stone cross. This place became a pilgrimage site for relatives wishing to honor the memory of those who remained forever in the ice. The mountains claimed 29 lives, leaving them to lie in their cold and silent cradle. The wind continues to howl over their grave, paying no heed to human grief. The lives of the 16 survivors went their separate ways. They started families, became doctors, businessmen, and writers. Nando Parado became a successful man, but he never forgot that icy night when he realized his loneliness. Roberto Canessa saved hundreds of lives as a cardiologist, as if repaying the universe for his own rescue. But every night, when they closed their eyes, they saw that blinding white snow again. The trauma of what they had experienced remained with them forever, deeply hidden beneath the mask of a normal life. The sound of falling snow, a sharp gust of cold wind, or simply silence could transport them back to the glacier. They learned to live with these ghosts, accepting them as an integral part of their story. They no longer feared the cold. They feared oblivion and losing their connection to one another. Their story spread around the world, becoming a symbol of the absolute human will to live against all odds. Books were written, films were made, but no work could convey the true horror of those days. Art tried to romanticize their journey, but in reality there was no heroism, only primal fear. It was a harsh, dirty, and brutal struggle of a species for its very existence. The Andes remained standing in their place, silent and indifferent to the suffering of ordinary people. They did not set out to kill the passengers on the flight. They simply existed according to their ancient, unshakable laws. The glacier that became the scene of this tragedy is slowly melting, hiding beneath it the last traces of the crashed plane. Nature is clearing its space, erasing the memory of the alien invasion of metal and flesh. Today, this story serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human life in the face of the elements. We build airplanes and cities and consider ourselves the masters of this planet, forgetting our own vulnerability. But a single instrument malfunction, a single blizzard, is enough to bring us back to the basics of survival. And then all that remains is sheer will, instinct, and the readiness to defy all prohibitions. Snow continues to fall in the mountains, covering the rocks with a soft, cold shroud of oblivion and eternity. None of the survivors has forgotten that moment, after which everything changed and there was no turning back. Their rescue was not a victory over nature. It was merely a temporary reprieve granted by fate. The Andes did not kill them quickly. They simply waited, and the echo of that icy silence still resonates today.